Hey besties, welcome back to my channel. So things are getting messy in the sister wives world because the kids are starting to speak up. Specifically, McKelie and Tony are now binge watching the older seasons. They're currently on season 6, and let's just say they are not holding back. After seeing what really went down, they're straight up calling the adults liars, and here's why. Back in season 6, the Browns participated in a panel at UNLV alongside former members of different polygamous groups. The goal was to share experiences, but instead, the whole thing turned tense, fast. It got heated, it got confrontational, and at times, it honestly felt like Robyn and Cody were attacking the very people who were opening up about their trauma in polygamy. Now, watching it back, McKelie and Tony aren't buying what was said at all. In their eyes, a lot of it just wasn't true. McKelie even said she was uncomfortable with how her own parents handled that panel. At one point, she admits, "I don't even want to call them my parents right now." That's how strongly she feels about it. She goes on to say that many of the answers given were pointed lies, especially when it came to money, because during that panel, the Browns claimed they were doing well financially, but according to McKelie, that's simply not true. She says their financial stability only came after the show. Before that, it was a completely different reality. We're talking bankruptcies, food stamps, kids struggling to eat, wearing inadequate clothing, living off things like MREs, and even stale bread at times. So when she hears her family paint this polished picture on stage, she knows it doesn't match what they actually lived through. And that's where things really start to bother her, because it wasn't just about their own story, it was about dismissing other people's pain. While former members were bravely sharing negative experiences in polygamy, the Browns were essentially pushing back, acting like those stories weren't valid or representative, and McKelie did not like that. She especially took issue with how Robyn responded to a young woman who spoke about neglect from her father, who had 14 wives. Instead of empathy, Robyn came across as defensive, even confrontational. The same thing happened with Kristen Decker, where the message seemed to be, if you didn't believe in this lifestyle, you wouldn't stay in it. But that completely ignores the complexity of these situations. And now, seeing it as an adult, McKelie is calling it out. She even says plainly their family lived in extreme poverty. This wasn't exaggerated. This wasn't media spin. This was real life. And hearing those past statements now, it just doesn't sit right. What makes this even more interesting is the perspective shift. Back then, McKelie was just a kid, but she still remembers what things were actually like. And now, re-watching everything, she's connecting the dots in a way she couldn't before. She also reveals something deeper. At that same time, her mom was struggling with severe depression and questioning both her marriage and polygamy itself. So when those difficult conversations came up publicly, it's possible some of the wives avoided engaging honestly because facing that truth might have pushed them to leave sooner. Instead, they stayed quiet. Or worse, they reshaped the narrative over and over again, not just to protect themselves, but to protect the image of polygamy. But according to McKelie and Tony, that came at a cost, because by downplaying or denying real struggles, they may have ended up invalidating people who were genuinely hurt. Tony even calls it out, saying it's a travesty because those stories deserve to be heard. And it doesn't stop there. In another clip, they watch the family in therapy and start noticing a pattern. Robyn often speaks for everyone, making sweeping statements about what the entire family feels, believes, and experiences, almost like she's defining the narrative for all of them. And that's when the criticism really sharpens, because as Tony points out, that's not reality. That's one person's version of it being projected onto everyone else. You're speaking for everybody, he says. You're imprinting your dream of polygamy onto the others. And honestly, that might be the biggest issue of all. Our family is a process. We're just trying to make order out of chaos. But when you really watch closely, you start to see what's actually going on. The other wives, they're quiet, reserved, almost submissive. And then there's Robyn, because the way she speaks tells you everything. When she's alone, it's I, but the second she's in a group, it becomes we. We're all doing this together. We're all growing. We're all working on this. But here's the problem. That we doesn't actually include everyone. It's Robyn speaking for everyone. She doesn't leave space for the other wives to express themselves. Instead, she defines the narrative for all of them. And that's where things start to shift. Because what you're really watching is Cody buying into Robyn's vision of polygamy completely. Not just accepting it, but enforcing it. Projecting it onto the rest of the family like it's the only version that matters. But the truth? The other wives didn't want that version at all. They were comfortable with something very different. A structure where Cody was the center, and the wives operated more independently. They could come together when needed, but they weren't trying to force some deep emotional sisterhood. That version worked for them. But Cody and Robyn kept pushing this idealized fantasy, a perfectly bonded, emotionally connected family unit. And you can actually see it play out in small, telling moments. Like that scene where they're all standing in a circle. Robyn is the only one holding Cody's hand, and at the same time, she's holding Mary's hand, almost creating space between Mary and Cody instead of bringing them together. It's subtle, but it's powerful, because it reflects something deeper. This wasn't just about connection, it was about control, positioning, and influence. Meanwhile, Cody is trying to force this idea of a perfect sister-wife bond that honestly never existed. And the reality, the other women didn't need it to exist. They didn't need to be best friends to function. But that expectation kept being pushed on them anyway. And that's why what McKelie says hits so hard. Because she doesn't sugarcoat it. She says it plainly. They were never friends. Not back then, not now. At best, they tolerated each other. Some relationships today are cordial, sure, but they're not deep, meaningful friendships, and they never will be. Some of them only talk when it comes to the show. Others can coexist peacefully, but that's where it ends. And that whole image of one big, happy, united family, according to her, it was a lie from day one, even before the cameras were rolling. Back when they all lived in one house in Lehigh, you'd think they were constantly together, but they weren't. The kids might move between spaces, but the wives? They lived completely separate lives, even under the same roof. And after that experience, none of them wanted to go back to that setup again. Because it didn't create unity, it created tension, pressure, conflict. It was a breaking point waiting to happen. McKelie even reveals that her mom wanted out back then. Mary wanted out too. So when the show started, the cracks were already there. But instead of showing that reality, they presented a completely different image, a united, loving, functional family. Then came the show, the money, the exposure, and suddenly there was a reason to maintain that image, so the narrative continued. They kept pushing this polished, idealized version of polygamy, even if it didn't reflect their real lives. And that's where the damage comes in. Because while they were selling this version to the world, there were real people, people who had experienced trauma, neglect, and abuse in similar systems, trying to speak out. And instead of being validated, they were dismissed, challenged, even attacked. And now, McKelie is acknowledging something important, that some of those experiences weren't exaggerated at all. Because in environments like this, tension builds, and when people can't express their frustration or pain openly, it doesn't just disappear, it gets redirected, sometimes toward other wives, sometimes toward the children. Because the system itself doesn't always allow honest emotion, it demands control, obedience, and silence. And that creates a cycle where people suppress how they feel just to survive. So what we're seeing now is something different, a shift, a crack in the narrative, a moment where the truth is starting to come through.
that maybe what was shown to the public wasn't the full story, that the image was carefully controlled, and that the reality was far more complicated and at times much darker. And as Tony points out, that's the real issue, because this was never just about one family. It shaped how millions of people understood polygamy, and if that image wasn't real, then the impact goes far beyond the Browns. It affects everyone who watched, believed, and built their understanding around that version. So what McKelie and Tony are calling out isn't just inconsistency, it's something much bigger. They're calling out a narrative, a system, and the consequences that came with it. And that's why this moment feels so different. Because for the first time, the truth isn't coming from the outside, it's coming from within the family itself. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I really want to hear your take on this. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thanks so much for watching. Bye, bestie.